15.
Good evening, everybody. Is that coming through okay? Yeah, great. I wanted to talk about Alan Turing because this year is his centenary year, and he's one of the nation's, I think, great unsung heroes. If we go back about a decade, we had the BBC poll of 100 Great Britons, and he wasn't in the top 10, some very great names there, and he wasn't in the top 20. I wanted to show you this because Michael Crawford is in it, number 17. And that baffles me, but at number 21 was Alan Turing. He was the 21st greatest Briton in this poll. And I think that was partly because the people who are great fans of Alan Turing are often computer scientists and nerds and geeks who know how to hack into these polls and rig them. Because 10 years ago, I don't think he was quite as well known as he is today. And even today, I think he's still under-recognized, which is why the centenary year has been so important. I suppose the thing he's most famous for is the cracking of the Enigma Cipher, which Daisy mentioned. And what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the Enigma, talk a bit about Alan Turing's role in cracking the Enigma, and then at the end briefly mention some of his other great achievements, because he wasn't a one-trick pony by any stretch of the imagination. Let me just run my clock to make sure I've got some idea how well or how badly I'm doing for time. There we go, right. Stopwatch. No, dearie me. There we go, right. So here is an Enigma machine. It was built by the Germans before the Second World War. There was an engineer called Arthur Scherbius who realized that in the age of radio communication, in the age of what was going to be blitzkrieg, coordinated military attack, you needed to have good communication and you needed to have secure communication, and the Enigma was what was going to make that happen. Here you see an Enigma machine in the bottom left-hand corner. I think that's General Guderian, I think on the Eastern Front. And you've got three people operating the Enigma. The person at the bottom, or the person in the middle has got a message, and they're reading out the message. The person below them is going to type it into a machine. It looks like a typewriter. As they type it into the machine, lamps light up, illuminating other letters. That's the encrypted message. The person jots down the encrypted message on their bit of paper, and the person at the top sends it off by radio. At the other end, someone else has got an Enigma machine. They type in the gobbledygook, and the original message appears in the lamp board. And so the message is easily encrypted and easily decrypted. And every single German unit had one of these machines. Every U-boat had one of these machines. Every airbase, every railway station. There were literally thousands of these machines distributed during the Second World War. And they were at the heart of the German communication system and at the heart of the blitzkrieg tactic. Now, I'm fortunate enough that I've got a machine here, and I'm going to try and see if I can project it onto the screen. I've got this great little camera here. It's not ideal for distance. It's actually best suited for close-up. This is my jumper. Let me see what it does. Isn't that fantastic? Isn't that the best thing in the world? Sorry. Couldn't resist doing that. Right. The best £49 we'll ever spend. Right. So. I'm going to go off mic a bit and shout, so hopefully you can still hear me. But this is an Enigma machine built before the war. So it was built in 1936. So even by this stage, the Germans were kind of gearing up for the outbreak of the war. And I'll type in some letters. If I type in the letter M, hopefully you'll see the letter light up. An I has lit up. If I type in M again, an L has lit up in the bottom right-hand corner. So the same input letter is giving a different output. And that's the key of the Enigma. I can type in the same letter over and over again, but I get what's called a random output, or a pseudo-random output. And what's going on is there are these three drums called rotors. And every time I type a key, an electrical signal goes down a wire into the rotor, and the rotors are like spaghetti. So the letter might go in as an A, but it gets scrambled up and comes out as a W. It goes in the second rotor as a W, gets scrambled up in the spaghetti, comes out as a B. Goes in the third rotor, comes out as a J or whatever. So it's a scrambled up wiring in those rotors that leads to the encryption. And the reason it changes every time is that every time I type a key, the rotors move. It's hard to see, yeah, it's a bit of a blurring, but you just see the rotor moving around. So if the rotors are moving around, the wiring is effectively changing. I'll just briefly take one out. There we go. So you can see the 26 contacts here, 26 contacts on the other side, and in between those 26 contacts, you've got three rotors, all rotating, all with spaghetti, all scrambling up the message. So that's what was at the heart of the Enigma. That's what made the encryption so complicated. Now, to break the Enigma, you needed two things. The British needed to have one of these machines. Now, having one of these machines is relatively simple, because the Germans had thousands. So sooner or later, you're going to steal one. Sooner or later, a double agent is going to give you one. You will get hold of one of these machines. The security is not in the machine. The security is in the way you set it up. And there are huge numbers of combinations of ways you can set up the machine. I can swap these rotors around. I've got three objects in three positions. That's 6 permutations. I can start off with these rotors in any one of 26 positions. 3 rotors, 26 positions is 26 cubed, which is about 17,000. Times the 6 permutations is about 100,000. When this rotor, the first rotor, does a full revolution, it kicks the next one. But where that kick happens, I can vary. That's another factor of 26. 26 times 100,000 is 2.5 million. The second rotor, I can vary the kickover point, that's 26 again. I think we're getting up to about 50 million permutations for this little combination here alone. There's another element of the Enigma at the front, which allows me to swap letters around. So if I plug in A with Z, it means if I type A, it follows the path of Z. If I type Z, it follows the path of A. And there are 100 million different ways to wire up that board. Times the 50 million I mentioned earlier, you can see it's a phenomenal problem. And that's where the security of the Enigma machine lay. If you wanted to crack this code, you had to get the machine, easy, and then you had to work out the combinations. Let me explain what then happened. So the Germans had this machine. The Germans assumed it was unbreakable. The British assumed it was unbreakable. The Americans, the French, everybody assumed that the Enigma was an uncrackable code. The only people that really had any intention, put any effort into breaking the Enigma were the Poles. Before the war broke out, they were surrounded by Russia on one side, Germany on the other side. They knew that sooner or later they were going to get invaded. And when the situation is that desperate, you try to do even the impossible. You try to break even the impossible code. And they recruited 3 mathematicians, most notably Marian Rejewski. And this was the first time mathematicians were brought into the code-breaking arena. Previously, it was thought to be linguists and linguistic scholars who could break code. Now, this was a mechanical object. It was a technological object. It was a mathematical entity. So they brought in mathematicians, and the Poles began to make crucial breakthroughs. But then Poland was invaded. Now, fortunately, those breakthroughs were smuggled out of Poland into France and into London before the information was captured. And that information was then taken to Bletchley Park, which was the home of the British code breakers during the Second World War, about 50 miles north of London. Now, this is the very first trip to Bletchley Park. A group of civil servants went there in 1939 to look at this mansion house, to check it out, to see whether there were grounds there available for building units, for growing a code-breaking center. Was it private enough? What were the communication links like? They pretended to be a hunting party out on a day trip, but in fact they were civil servants scouting out the location to check it was the right place. And then a few weeks later, the code breakers turned up. Just anybody who loved a puzzle was recruited to Bletchley Park. Hugh Alexander was probably the best English chess player at the time. Gordon Welshman was an engineer. And the most famous code breaker at Bletchley was Alan Turing, who I want to focus on today. Now, Turing, it was very much a team effort. But Turing came up with an incredibly important idea, which paid huge dividends during the course of the war. I'll try and explain to you what he did. His work was built on the work of a woman called Mavis Beatty, who was another codebreaker at Bletchley. And Mavis, let me explain to you a bit more about the Enigma. There's one thing I need to tell you about the Enigma. Let me show you what the machine looked like in a bit more detail. No, we don't want to go there. Let's try going up there. So this is an Enigma emulator. So I can type a letter, I can type K, and letters light up again. It's just like the Enigma I've shown you. I type the same letter again, a different letter lights up. But with this, I can take you inside again, and this time you can see what's going on. If I type the letter A, you can see the rotors will move, and you can follow the electrical path. Now, if I type A again, the first rotor moves, and you can follow the electrical path again. It's a different output. Now, one of the things you can see here, which I didn't mention a second ago when I showed you the Enigma, is that the signal goes right through the three rotors and then gets reflected back on the far end. That's called a reflector. And it goes back through the three rotors, so I type in an A, it goes all the way through, comes back as a D. What the reflector does is it sends the message, the signal back down a different path. If the signal goes back down a different path, it can never get back to where it started. So one of the quirks of the Enigma is that no letter can ever be encrypted as itself. Okay? No letter can ever be encrypted as itself. And that doesn't seem like a big problem because you've got 25 other letters that you can encrypt as. So that's not a problem, it doesn't seem. But Mavis had a bright idea. She was trying to decrypt a message one day. And she had it in her hands, and she was looking at it, and it was 300 characters, and it was just gobbledygook, and she didn't know what it meant. She was trying to decipher it. And she looked at the 300 characters, and then it clicked. In the 300 characters, there wasn't one W. Now, if you've got 300 characters and there are 26 letters, about 1 in 26 should be W's, so about 10 or 12 should have been W's. But the message was devoid of any W's. Now, the only way you can get an output that is devoid of W's is if you type in W 300 times. If you type in W 300 times, then the output will have everything except W's. And so she'd broken the code. The message was simply W 300 times. Now, it's not the most interesting message in the world, I grant you. But once you know the input, 300 W's, and once you know the output, the thing you've got in your hand, you can work out the settings of the machine. And once you know the settings of the machine for that day, because it changed every day, you can then decipher everything else sent that day. And one of the messages she was able to decipher was about an attack on the British fleet at Alexandria. The British fleet were warned, and as a result of that, it was the first Allied victory in the Mediterranean. Now, the crucial breakthrough here was that if you know a little bit of the input, if you know all of the input, even better, but even if you know a little bit of the input and you know the output, you can work out the settings of the machine. And Turing built on that. He said, well, surely we can, 2 minutes? Surely we can work out some bit of some messages. So if I get a message coming from over there, then I know there's a weather station over there. I know that message will talk about the wind direction and the level of fog and so on. In fact, we've got a weather ship over there as well, so I know exactly what that message says. If I know what that weather ship is saying, I can work out the setting of the machine. If I can work out the setting of the machine, I can decipher other more important messages rather than just the weather. And with that kind of breakthrough, Turing and his colleagues were able to essentially read the German messages as quickly as the Germans could. And there were blackout periods, and some codes were harder than others, but it was an amazing breakthrough. It suddenly meant that Churchill knew where the weaknesses were on D-Day. He knew where the German supply lines were. He knew where the German strengths were. All because the group of code breakers at Bletchley Park had cracked the Enigma. Now, the tragedy of Turing, I'll just wrap up with this, the tragedy, of course, is that he died in 1954, and at that stage, Enigma was still top secret. And so when he died, nobody realized that he'd made this enormous contribution, one of the greatest contributions to the war effort. And not just the cracking of the Enigma, that was just one of the things he did. He pioneered computing. After the war, he worked at Manchester and the National Physical Laboratory, and he built the very first computers. More than that, before the war, he wrote the very first papers theoretically predicting what a computer would be and what a computer could do. And not only that, in terms of what they could do, he built the whole area of what we now call artificial intelligence. He was decades ahead of his time. He's the father of what we call artificial intelligence. And in another area completely, he looked at patterns. How do patterns in nature emerge? There can't be a gene for spotted coats or a gene for stripy coats. That's essentially a mathematical, chemical issue. And he came up with the foundations of that, which today we use to explain why we find spiral patterns in sunflowers and so on. So in short, he was an extraordinary man. What he did at Bletchley is incredible. But what he did in other fields still lives with us today in terms of the technology and the computing that's all around us. But just coming back to that one thing I mentioned, I said in 1954 when he died, people didn't know he'd broken the Enigma code. In 1964 they didn't know. In 1974 they didn't know. Now, why was it that for 30 years Enigma was kept a secret? Why was it that Bletchley Park was kept a secret? Well, the reason that all of this code-breaking effort was kept quiet was that when the war ended, the Allies swept through Europe, they gathered up dozens of these machines, hundreds of these machines, and they brought them back to London, they brought them back to Whitehall. Now, of course, the Whitehall seniors knew that the Enigma code had been compromised. They knew that the British could break the Enigma, but nobody else knew that. And so the British government would ring up other countries like Canada and Australia, and they would say, hey, we've got hundreds of these Enigma machines, the Germans swear by them, why don't you have them? And because of that, Enigma had to be kept a secret, and tragically, Turing's role had to be kept a secret, and all of the other people that worked for him, which is why it's such a great opportunity in his centenary to remember Alan Turing and everybody else who was at Bletchley. Thank you very much.